you want to support Missing Witches, you can do so by buying yourself a present from Foxglove Farm. Yeah. What a wonderful way to support us, because of course by supporting Foxglove Farm, you're supporting Missing Witches.
This episode is about wild creation in the liminal spaces, and it's about magical thinking and fate, and a remarkable artist witch who had to figure out who she was after the unthinkable atrocities of the Second World War and outside of a powerful man's powerful idea about her destiny. A man who did the Babylon working and believed she was the fire elemental he had summoned. And maybe in a way she was, but she was also an entirely her own self. Yes, this episode is about Marjorie, Cameron, and Jack Parsons. And it's about love and how we cope when we lose someone. And it's about 1960s California and art and drugs and sex magic and becoming gods through art. And it's about how the world changes. L. Ron Hubbard makes a brief appearance as a sci-fi writing ceremonial magic apprentice and a seedy con man pre-Scientology. Are you surprised? And we'll get to talk about early rocket science and UFOs and the Beat Generation and yet another artist witch who also might have been a spy, but who was, above all and all her life, an artist, with all the immensity and multitudes that word contains. Yes, loves, gather round and burn a little something down in honor of the wild and wise and hallucinatory and magical bisexual fire elemental artist witch who preferred to be known only as Cameron.
You aren't being a proper woman, therefore you must be a witch. 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 You must be a witch.
She's been called an icon of the beat scene in Los Angeles, who held an underground, even mythic status within art history. People are just beginning to understand her influence in post-war art and culture. A leader in the counterculture and mother of a uniquely American magical lineage. An essay in Los Angeles Review of Books by Steffi Nelson is one of the major sources for this episode. I'd like to start where she ends. Here's the full quote of her conclusion. In a letter to his wife that was part of their voluminous correspondence while she was traveling during the early days of their marriage, Parsons attempted to impress upon her that the invocation of lesser forces, including angels, demons, and elementals, is far more dangerous than the invocation of gods. The lower work, he continued, is an act of science, while in the higher work you are actually wooing the god. It is an act of art. Following this logic, Nelson continues, maybe we can conclude that Cameron, the elemental herself, was invoking only God, the higher force, in her work, leaving us with her art. Parsons believed Cameron's work went beyond his own, that her art magic was a crux in the rebirth of the world into a better, freer place. He wrote, "You, Cinderella of the wastelands, have chosen the way of the hero, and the gods alone may guess the end of your path." Her path was a struggle, and it didn't go in straight lines, and there isn't much of her art left, since she had a practice of ritually burning some. My other favorite writer about Cameron so far, anyway, is Tanya M. Layden, who wrote a piece called The Witch Woman Sings for LA Weekly, where we find this story. Shirley Berman remembers Cameron calling shortly after she burned her art in an incinerator in the mid-50s. When the Bermans arrived at Cameron's home, they found a fragile, trembling artist, her work destroyed. Decades later, Kenneth Anger explained she was releasing the spirit that she put in the drawing into the fire, meaning Cameron sacrificed her art as an act of conscious, occult-inspired transmutation. Once the art moved beyond her imagination, it had also served its purpose and became unnecessary, providing Cameron the opportunity to emancipate herself from it physically. It was released, Anger continued. In other words, if she'd kept them as drawings or paintings, she would have been enchained to them. The destroyed art includes much of what's featured in The Wormwood Star, which has since become a rare visual record of Cameron's earlier works. Nonetheless, Cameron created even more and continued her peripatetic existence, even with her daughter in tow. In 1957, the two moved in with Cameron's friend David Meltzer, a poet, in San Francisco. And today, Meltzer laments the fact that interest in Cameron's work became so entwined with Aleister Crowley and Jack Parsons rather than standing on its own. I must admit, he says, that any time I've run into a person who's interested in Cameron, and they're usually guys, it's because they're interested in Parsons and black magic and Crowley, kind of like Beavis's and Butthead's, 77-year-old Meltzer quips. I had great regard for her work, both graphic and written, and I'm sorry that her past involvement with Crowley seems to have been one of the primary waves that she's perceived, rather than really as a very fascinating and worthwhile artist and poet. I mean, yes, she was a practitioner of the Hermetic, the occult, but it's unfortunate that she's not regarded as the creative artist and strong spirit that she is. The most comprehensive retrospective of her work was at the LA Museum of Contemporary Art in October 2014. And the collection video and writing by the curator is powerful, especially as it moves across the last pieces in the collection. A humming, resonant series of line drawings that look like maps of sound waves, or like singing messages from the universe, in a collection called Pluto Transiting the 12th House. These are so different from the rest of her work. I think about them when I meditate looking out the window at our lake, where Amy and Andy are sitting now, steely and cold in the fall. These are works for later in life, with a knowledge about fall. Mocha also released a video of her reading her poetry called An Evening with Cameron. It was her last public performance, and it's out there on the YouTubes. She reads steady gray hair, wild and candle haloed. She says these things and much more. I took pieces that sang out to me to share with you. I am that dream of wings. You are the totality, I said it before. I pried all truth and lies to shreds to appease the doubt until at last, not through a single act, but through all acts, I find myself in the landscape of your star. Mother, all life has fed at your golden breast. All dreams are spun from your silken lyre. O Mother, you have come at last out of the earth, born from the corn. Oh, the many steps of the way. Oh, the many steps of the way. Okay, now that we've begun to sketch her from her own words, let's step back and begin again. Because Cameron has spent a lot of time as a side note in other men's stories, or as a lurid caricature. And when I turn to those references to help spin her story, I want you to hold this image in your mind. Steady in the candlelight, a lifetime of art that maybe summoned God. Maybe helped birth the wild, new, unenslaved era of humanity burning around her, expanding around all of us. Rising ever brighter now, that age of Aquarius we've been watching come, slowly, brightly. Both frail and infinitely powerful. Both flawed and wildly brave. Cameron was born April 23rd, 1922 in Belle Plaine, Iowa, and if Spencer Kansa, author of her unauthorized but heavily interview-based biography, is to be believed, she grew up haunted by her mother's sister, who died after insisting she be named Marjorie instead of Gail. Cameron was much more of a raging Gael than a Marge, and despite her aunt's attempt at getting Lee to a nunnery, she ended up an artist witch who broke the hearts of girls and boys in Iowa and beyond, who briefly ran a sex cult in the desert and saw ghosts all her life. And she was a gifted artist from childhood. Belle Plaine residents remembered when, still basically a kid, she was commissioned by the town to make art in patterns along the banks of a roadway for a celebration. At 15, she became pregnant, and her mother performed an abortion at home. After that, her late-night cemetery visits became more regular. Even when an abortion is your choice, and clearly the best choice, it can reverberate in you for a while, I think, sometimes forever. It's a choice no person makes lightly. And though we know from all kinds of statistics around the world showing a reduction in crime rates 18 years following the legalization of abortion, that pregnant people are very good at knowing they should or should not bring a life into the world, it can still give you a shadow for a little while. Or a lightness, a freedom, a deep knowingness that your own life and decision-making is of value, that you can have power, that each of us carries with us not just life but also death at all times. The weight of this act carries the weight of the whole world we live in, and whether that world is good and safe. Whether this piece of rumor from Kansa about Cameron is true, it is definitely a story that has been true of many women. Dangerous home abortions by unqualified people with questionable motivations proliferate when safe legal options aren't available, and people die. Let's not make any fucking mistakes on that one. Ironically, Cameron's ticket out of small-town America and toward the counterculture came through the United States Navy, which she joined in 1943 as part of a women's initiative spearheaded by Eleanor Roosevelt. She became a map maker for the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. The last-name military form of address also gave her the moniker that she felt suited her better than Marjorie. Cameron was among the first women to ever join the U.S. Armed Forces, and according to Kansa, she worked on a covert mission that brought her into contact with Churchill and de Gaulle, and that required her to lean on her powerful and seductive presence to elicit secrets. I mean, maybe. We definitely knew she drew maps and designed sets and costumes for propaganda efforts, and that she walked away from the army one day but was still mysteriously granted an honorable discharge. And then she made her way to California and stepped into the jazz world of the house called the Parsonage, Jack Parsons' house where rocket scientists and sci-fi writers hung with Aleister Crowley students and lodge members, and where black and white musicians held late-night jams and cohabitated illegally. Okay, so Jack Parsons is an occult conspiracy theorist goldmine, apparently using rituals dedicated to Pan to get some of the first rockets to fly, helping found the Jet Propulsion Lab that would contribute to an insane piece of unfathomable magic sending human beings, Earth animals, off their mother planet to the moon. And he worked magic derived from Dr. John Dee, royal astrologer to Elizabeth I, who came highly recommended by Crowley, out in the desert by Devil's Gate with L. Ron Hubbard as his scribe. Yes, L. Ron Hubbard, who stole Jack's wife Betty, and then stole $20,000 from him, and then went on to ever greater swindles. In his book Strange Angel, George Pendle writes, driven to distraction by the loss of Betty and without the incessant work of wartime rocket research to absorb his attention, Parsons threw himself into the only other part of his life he could control, his magic. He'd been turning his interests to the more perverse branches of occultism in his quest to conjure up actual spiritual phenomena. And so began the fevered days of the Babylon working. He began by tracing 5-pointed stars in the air and reciting ancient invocations in both English and Enochian, the strange sing-song language that Dee thought was passed down to him from angels. Strewn around him on the floor were paper tablets covered with arcane symbols and languages. He recited line after line of ominous and obscure scripture. Dear thou me, for I am the angel of Paphro, Osoronofris, Osoronofris. This is thy true name, handed down to the prophets of Israel. The ritual called for focused masturbation, what the Golden Bough would have recognized as sympathetic magic, as Parsons tried to fertilize the magical tablets around him and bring his elemental to life. Finally, he performed the banishing rites, a symbolic erasing of all the previous rituals, by retracing in reverse all the pentagrams and hexagrams he had drawn in the air. The entire process took some 2 hours, and it invariably left Parsons both physically and mentally exhausted, and believing that by jerking off alone in a circle, repeating a piece of poetry onto paper he had drawn, he was creating his ideal partner. He performed the ritual repeatedly over the following weeks, so thirsty for results that soon he was invoking his elemental twice each day. He liked to play Prokofiev's second violin concerto on his gramophone as an accompaniment. He started using his own blood instead of semen, and, his mind sensitive with anticipation, he began to record any phenomena he thought were related to his actions. A violent windstorm followed the first ritual. On another night, he was awakened by a series of loud and rapid knocks, and a table lamp across from his bed was thrown violently to the floor, even though the windstorm had died out. In a letter to Crowley, he announced, I have been extremely careful and conscientious in this ritual, lending all my will and scientific training to its precision and preparation, yet nothing seems to have happened. The windstorm is very interesting, but that's not what I asked for. A few days later, he performed the ritual twice more and observed further unexplained phenomena. At around 9 p.m., the electricity failed, and Hubbard, who was in the kitchen at the time, called out to Parsons, saying he had been struck strongly on the right shoulder. Parsons hurried to Hubbard's side, and in Parsons' word, the two observed a brownish-yellow light about 7 feet high in the kitchen. Parsons ran back to his bedroom, grabbed one of the swords hanging from the wall, and hurried back to the kitchen to perform a banishing ritual, burning sulfur and tobacco to aid him in his task. The figure seemed to diminish, and Parsons followed it into the library, all the while drawing pentagrams in the air with his sword. Finally, the form dwindled into nothing. Parsons diligently noted that Hubbard's right arm remained paralyzed for the rest of the night. Parsons was already impressed by Hubbard's grasp of Crowley's teachings, but now he became convinced of Hubbard's supreme magical sensitivity. The distress Parsons felt about Hubbard's relationship with Betty was quickly overcome by his remarkable will to believe. He invited Hubbard to sit in on his future rituals, and the visions continued to appear. On one occasion, Hubbard said that he saw an apparition of Wilfred Smith materialize behind Parsons. Before Parsons knew what was happening, Hubbard pinned it to the door with 4 throwing knives with which he was expert. Later in his room, Parsons heard the strange raps again, and a buzzing metallic voice crying, "Let me go free." Were these really spirits speaking to him, conjured up by his rituals, or was someone else providing Parsons with the phenomenon he so desperately wanted? Hubbard had taken over Smith's old bedroom across the hall, so he and Betty would have been ideally positioned to stage supernatural occurrences, especially with the help of the house's secret passageways. If Hubbard was using his imaginative skills to give Parsons satisfaction, then Parsons was all too willing to accept the gift. However, Parsons did not care to speculate about any underhanded tactics. Instead, he wrote in his record, "I felt a great pressure and tension in the house that night, which was also noticed by the other occupants. The tension might, of course, just as easily have been caused by Parsons' insistence on burning sulfur in the kitchen and swinging a sword through the living room, not to mention the twice-daily rituals chanted loudly in the Enochian tongue. The tension might, of course, just as easily have been caused by Parsons' insistence on burning sulfur in the kitchen and swinging a sword through the living room, not to mention the twice-daily rituals chanted loudly in the Enochian tongue." After 2 weeks, Parsons and Hubbard traveled into the Mojave Desert together. It had been some time since Parsons had come out here for his rocket experiments. More recently, he had escaped to the desert for seclusion in which to meditate and practice his magic. His favorite place was marked by the intersection of two massive power lines. At sunset, the two men stood beneath them, and suddenly Parsons felt the tension snap. I turned to him and said, "It is done," in absolute certainty that the operation was accomplished. I returned home and found a young woman answering the requirements waiting for me. Parsons had summoned his elemental. Her arrival coincided exactly with Parsons' return from the Mojave. He was overwhelmed by the magnetism between the two of them. In a letter to Crowley, Parsons declared, "I have my elemental," describing her as fiery and subtle, determined and obstinate, sincere and perverse, with extraordinary personality and intelligence. He immediately began performing sex magic rituals with her. A strange but not atypical welcome for a new member of the household. "I am to invoke continually, this now being possible and easy," he wrote to Crowley. And for Candy, she cared little about the mystical dimensions of their bedroom antics. "I didn't know very much about Jack's magical work. In fact, I probably derided it," she recalled. Nevertheless, for the next 2 weeks, the couple barely left Parsons' room. The magical working he now began was his most ambitious yet. He believed he could incarnate an actual goddess on Earth, a female messiah named Babylon. The ritual, Pendle explained to LA Weekly, was Parsons' attempt to usher in a new era in mankind's history. He believed that this age would begin with the arrival of Babylon, a female goddess in human form. Parsons' Babylon, inspired by the Babylon in the Bible's Book of Revelations, was to bring about a new libertarian age of free love and anti-authoritarianism, a world vision that was fulfilled to a certain extent with the arrival of the 1960s. He continues, "Cameron was an intrinsic part of this summoning, and Parsons bound her to him through this epic-changing event. This was not just an intense relationship, it was an apocalyptic one. Even after Parsons' death, the Babylon working would stay with Cameron, infusing her life with a narrative of epic proportions." In interviews, however, Cameron was more circumspect. "They worked with me without telling me what was going on. Everybody assumes I was in on it, that I really knew, but I didn't know." According to Cameron, Hubbard ran off to Miami soon after the ritual, and the communications got more and more weird. A Ouija board instructed her and Parsons to get rid of Hubbard's stuff and get the hell out of their house, she said, so they did. While Cameron described her relationship with Parsons as a love story, it wasn't without drama. Beginning in 1948, she lived in Mexico for 2 years after she and Parsons agreed to an open marriage. "I associated with homosexuals. I had lovers among bullfighters. I went nude bathing with mariachis. I danced in a whorehouse," she recalled in a 1977 recording. After an impassioned letter-writing affair with Parsons, however, Cameron moved back to California to physically reunite with him. The magical relationship between Cameron and Parsons is typically presented as a teacher-student relationship, and it's clear that Parsons had a profound influence on Cameron, sharing his knowledge of Kabbalah, tarot, astrology, and more. But as he could tell immediately, she was also uncommonly independent. The couple famously spent their first 2 weeks together in bed, but after they were married in late 1946, they were apart for long periods and took other lovers. Cameron traveled to Europe in 1947 and the following year left to study art in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico, on the GI Bill. There she encountered kindred spirits. Leonora Carrington, the surrealist artist who would also serve as an important mentor to mystical filmmaker Alejandro Jodorowsky, and met Renata Drux and Paul Matheson, who would later connect her to Kenneth Anger. While Cameron was on her way to making love and art and meeting beautiful minds in Mexico, Parsons fell down the last of the rabbit hole set up for him by L. Ron Hubbard. He put his entire savings into a scheme for Hubbard and Jack's ex-wife to buy yachts in Miami and sail them to California, which ended up being a setup for them to party on yachts and travel the world on Parsons' dime. Parsons called them back with a storm, but the money was long gone. Shortly after this, Hubbard pens a Dianetics essay in astounding science fiction, and it's a hit. He does away with the complexities of psychiatry, and for only $600, you can start to go clear. Within months, he published a book which became a national bestseller. Pendle suggests Hubbard took some philosophy from Aleister Crowley and built the world religion Crowley had envisioned himself at the helm of. Crowley saw through Hubbard and warned Parsons about him before he died. We don't know what Cameron thought, but she watched these men wanting desperately to summon power to know and shape the universe. Imagine wanting to go to the moon in the 1930s when the idea still got you laughed out of the room. Imagine trying to make art and science and magic in the aftermath then of World War II, when one could be forgiven for feeling nothing much made sense, when humanity could go so deeply, violently insane. And then imagine you are Cameron, and you made it out of Belle Plaine and out of the war machine, and you found the joyful, uninhibited jazz magic of the parsonage, and a love who thought you were pure fire goddess magic, who was even willing for you to have an open relationship, and who thought your art was holy, and who, whether you shared his philosophy or not, believed in helping to bring about a better day. And then imagine one day when you are packing up for a vacation, he dies in a ball of fire, and you don't know why or how. Maybe it was magic gone too hot. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe it was murder by a crooked cop. At 23, Jack had been called as an expert witness in the trial of Earl Kennett, a dirty cop. He created a replica of the bomb Kennett used in the attempted assassination of a rival. Days before Parsons was killed by an almost identical explosion, Kennett had been set free. We can't say for sure, but we do know Cameron believed he had been murdered, and she went off in a kind of a spiral after this. She made her way to the desert. She made a home out there. No electricity, no running water, but it was beautiful nonetheless, apparently. The home of an artist freed to wander late at night and talk to the moon and welcome travelers and beautiful friends of all genders and races to get deeply high together in a world made of art, to practice sex magic or just fun, kinky play. Maybe try to finish Jack's work. Maybe get pregnant and give birth to that new dawn, that new life. People like to talk about this part of her life like she was trying to start a sex cult. And yes, there is some weird stuff with pairing up people of different races, and some totally fucked up shit happened, I think. But what it sounds most like to me is a witch in mourning. It makes me think of that other California goddess, Joan Didion, and her book, The Year of Magical Thinking, about loss, and how very difficult our fragile, world-shaping minds find it to adjust to the unexpected radical loss of the ones we love, the ones we build our lives around. Because sometimes our magic does let us grip fate and birth new realities. And sometimes on the flip side, we can lose touch with the world by force of wanting something so hard. Wanting someone to not be sick, wanting someone to not be gone, wanting to light all of civilization on fire if it'll bring back the person who made us feel safe and made things make sense. In a poem called Star by Jack Parsons, he writes, "I remember when I was a star in the night, a moving, burning ember amid the bright clouds of star fire going deathward to the womb." Going deathward to the womb. I'd love to know Cameron's thoughts as she exchanged letters with Joseph Campbell about the hero's journey years after Jack's death and after she came out of the desert. I wonder if Cameron and the great mythologist would see in this a twist of the heroine's journey, or the witch's journey, or the journey of an uncontainable woman in post-war, post-nuclear, post-moon landing America. Something modern and ancient mythic about losing safety and love and going to the underworld, the other world, the desert or the moon, and then the long, slow process of crafting a new skin, building that dream of wings, being reborn.
We are trying as hard as we can to keep Missing Witches free and accessible for everyone. So please check out our sponsor, Foxglove Farm, where you can subscribe to wonderful monthly gift boxes, or you can get teas, handmade soap.
Oh my gosh, teas with specific healing love worked into them. This witch in her kitchen is combining herbs with a lot of knowledge and a lot of care and a lot of ethical practices that make us feel really comfortable recommending them to you.
Extremely ethical practices. I mean, we went in, we don't want to be hypocrites, so we asked a lot of questions, and honestly, Sammy gave us every answer we were hoping for. It's cruelty-free. She gets her herbs and everything that she uses from the most ethical source she can find.
Yeah, it's palm oil free.
Mm-hmm.
Palm oil depresses the fuck out of me. I was so happy she said that.
Yes.
I love orangutans.
Yes. So again, I mean, we're so grateful and so lucky to be partnered with Foxglove Farm. Please go to foxglovefarm.com and use offer code Missing Witches for a super witchy 13% discount.
For now, we look through keyholes, windows. We watch as a camera lovingly moves through the landscape of her stunning paintings in Wormwood Star. One of the best places to see Cameron's work since so much was ritually destroyed. In his autobiography, Nice Guys Don't Work in Hollywood, Harrington explained that the film Wormwood Star is really about Cameron's work as a painter, and the thrust of the film is to present the artist as an alchemist who, through her creative work, becomes herself transmuted into gold. One of the best places to see and understand her magnetic presence and to see the way other artists in her scene perceived her is in Kenneth Anger's mythical hallucinatory film Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome from 1954. As legend has it, when director and star first met, Cameron proclaimed, "I am the Scarlet Woman," and Anger responded, "I've been waiting to meet you for 1,000 years." James Conway wrote for Strange Flowers, Cameron retains a special role in the history of experimental filmmaking for her part in Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome. An extraordinary multi-leveled piece of film art, Inauguration represents a ritualistic parade of deities and archetypes. Cameron, draped in a shawl which once belonged to Rudolph Valentino, plays both the Scarlet Woman and the Hindu goddess Kali in the biggest false eyelashes you've ever seen. Also along for the trip, besides Curtis Harrington and Anger himself, is French author Anaïs Nin, who had previously appeared in experimental films by her husband Hugh Parker, Gruyère, and Maya Deren. She appears as the goddess Astarte in one of the film's most arresting images, in which her head is framed both by a birdcage and a sickle moon. At 38 minutes, this is one of Anger's longest works, and it includes overlaid excerpts from his own film, Puce Moment. The whole thing is set to Janacek's Glagolithic Mass, an incongruous choice given the film's occult themes, and it is most likely the closest any of us will get to see a drag Baroque opera in Hades. I mean, I don't know what drag shows you go to, but all right. Many biographies of her focus mostly on Wormwood Star and Pleasure Dome, alongside a couple other times when she flickers into light in the popular history of the emerging counterculture, like the time one of her drawings got a gallery shut down. In 1957, Wallace Berman had his first exhibition of his artworks at the newly opened Fearus Gallery in Los Angeles. His friends were the curators owners of the gallery, Ed Keinholz, Robert Alexander, and Walter Hopps. After the opening, the LA Vice Squad got a telephone tip from an anonymous caller, and during the raid, they found what was deemed to be pornographic image by Cameron Parsons, entitled Peyote Vision, at the bottom of one of Berman's assemblage works called Tempo. He would later be convicted of displaying lewd and obscene materials. At the summation in the courtroom, Berman wrote on the blackboard, "There is no justice, only revenge." Berman's mail art publication, Semina, was a series of folio packages that were limited edition and sent or given to his friends. Semina consisted of collages mixed with poetry by writers Charles Bukowski, William S. Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg, Jean Cocteau. Semina was published from 1955 to 1964, and Cameron was on the cover of the first issue. Cameron had always lived out of step with time. In the late 1950s, she was sick with allergies, rotten teeth, and an untreated ulcer, and married for the second time, though it wouldn't work out. She performed poetry and spent time at the Unicorn Cafe on the Sunset Strip, the first real beat hangout in the city, where Ginsberg, Maya Angelou, and Lenny Bruce all came to perform new material. A place where rebellion had a place to grow. At this time, Cameron was described as an explorer going into uncharted territory. Her creative drive governed her life. There was no compromising whatsoever. Cameron's work was not viewer-friendly. It was viewer-disturbing. In the late 50s, according to Kansa in his interview with the founder of the Unicorn, no one thought of beat as a movement. It soon became mythologized and refined. Within a year or two, there was an explosion of 60 coffee houses in LA. Increasing numbers diluted the initial hipness, and the so-called beat generation was swiftly codified and stereotyped by the mainstream media as a bunch of goatee-sporting, beret-wearing, bongo-bashing goofs. By that time, it was tourists and weekend beatniks, Cohen explained. Beat had changed already by 1959. It was exploited. Shops were selling black leotards and berets. Kerouac to me was like Bob Dylan later. They both wrote about people who were doing it. They articulated it. They were the messengers. Times they are changing. But they didn't change the time. Cameron and the people around her were the ones actually doing it. This is quite an accolade from Cohen to one of his former patrons, someone who still makes a big impression on him to this day. Cameron was so striking, and people were wary of her. She was not approachable. She didn't sit down and have conversations. She wasn't a garrulous, outgoing personality. She walked around in her own space and place. She was spacey in her own world. She was a few years ahead, more hippie than beat. Cameron was before all of this. She was the real thing. She was admired and adored, and she was often alone. She painted rocks out in the desert where she felt everything was alive and sacred, and out there she received communications from the sky, visions of time travel and of other dimensions. In Kansa's book, one artist tells a story of Cameron telling him something one evening that didn't make sense to him until 900 years later. Another says she had eyes of a werewolf, where if you flinch or look away, there's something lacking in you. She struggled to raise her daughter in ways that could align with her life and her visions of the new world. Tanya Layden is the only biographer of Cameron's I've found who touches seriously on her life as a mother and grandmother, and I'm so interested in how we as witch women evolve to play these roles. My daughter's almost 1. I got a letter this morning from a listener who shared with me about losing her daughter, about how she knew something was wrong before it happened, and no one believed her. A gift and a curse for the witch women. I cried and I cried and I laid my head on the desk and I cried for this woman's loss and for her astonishing bravery. She tore her whole life apart after the loss, but 8 years later, she has happiness, love, work as an artist. She persists and more, she fucking brilliantly shines and reaches out with vulnerability into the loving web again. My daughter got so sick this year a couple times. I'll talk about it more in the All Hallows episode, but I have repeatedly thought that if she died, I would need to die. I want her to be safe and happy so badly that I semi-seriously daydream about raising her to believe there is no world outside our little house tucked into the wooded hill looking out at our little lake. I want to make up a whole new world for her to live in that is beautiful and without pain and only has like 6 neighbors. According to some, Cameron had dreamed for a while of getting pregnant with Jack, and after he died, of getting magically pregnant with a child that would be the outcome of their workings. When she did get pregnant with her daughter, and she named her for that perfect, complex, magical structure, the crystal, and she was in the midst of traveling and making art and living with men and women who inspired her, and being part of a movement that was trying to birth a more free, more loving, more peaceful world, I can understand that she brought her crystal everywhere with her. That she upended the rules of the man's world to invent a new reality for Crystal. And I can also understand how that might have made a life that didn't always feel safe for the child. Layden writes, Cameron's experimentation with drugs didn't abate once she had her daughter. In artist John Chamberlain's unfinished 1969 film Thumbsuck, made in Santa Fe, and kept at the Cameron Parsons Foundation, Cameron is filmed applying kabuki-style makeup and smoking a blunt while the filmmaker's children and Cameron's daughter gather around, mesmerized. She also didn't enroll her daughter in school, preferring a sort of freestyle homeschooling. Cameron's attitude was the only way Crystal could learn anything was just to engage with it, Meltzer remembers. If people didn't like it, they'd have to tell her they didn't like it, but that Cameron wasn't going to intervene as the mom figure in any of these cases. Today, Crystal Kimmel, 58, lives in Desert Hot Springs with her 32-year-old son. She let me stay out of school, Kimmel says of her mother. I started being bullied because I couldn't read or write back in first grade because I had dyslexia, and they didn't know that I had dyslexia or what it was. They thought I was retarded. So instead of her pushing me to stay, she just kind of let me, do what I wanted. Another of Cameron's longtime friends was Patricia Quinn, ex-girlfriend of Marlon Brando and the actress who played the title character in the 1969 film Alice's Restaurant. Quinn met Cameron in the late 60s when both were living in Santa Fe and found herself impressed by Cameron's integrity as an artist. I recognized her as an original, a pioneer in feminism, Quinn said. We were both rebels, fleeing our traditional backgrounds and making a new path for ourselves. Still, Cameron's odd parenting style worried Quinn. I had intense feelings about her mothering skills. She seemed to distance herself from any responsibility for Crystal's actions. I was no expert myself, but I couldn't understand her lack of concern. In the end, though, Quinn stresses that Cameron was an honorable woman. She was true to herself, and that's why she was a great artist. Cameron's daughter laments never having had the structure she feels she needed. I think she could have taught me more things than I taught myself. I had to grow up fast. She didn't leave me the tools to sort of get through everything on my own. She let me experience things with her that maybe other mothers would say, why did Cameron do this? She let her daughter experience LSD with her when I was about 9 years old. Kimmel has raised 6 children of her own. She's earthy, strong, and straightforward. But Cameron's devotion to her art had a destabilizing effect. As an adult, Kimmel found herself in abusive relationships and taking heavy drugs, although she says those days are long behind her. By the end of 1973, Cameron was a grandmother, and she settled into the role by foregoing her nomadic lifestyle in favor of fostering bonds with her grandkids. Her firstborn grandchild, Iris Hinzo, now 40, has a unique impression of her grandmother, one that's in contrast to the witchy, itinerant, art-destroying Scarlet Woman and negligent parent. My grandmother was the backbone of the family, Hinzo says. While Hinzo's parents were freebasing, brawling, and calling the police, Hinzo found refuge in Cameron's charming home in West Hollywood. It's just, she was very safe. My mom's home wasn't safe for me, she says. My grandmother raised me, pretty much. In her later years, Cameron gardened, cooked organic food, drank tea, smoked pot, and earned a teaching certificate in Tai Chi. She also became interested in the Hopi culture and homeopathy. She'd still perform rituals at every solstice, burning candles, lighting incense, chanting and ringing bells like priests do, Hinzo says with a smile. I take so much comfort in this image of Cameron as a grandmother, a backbone, a priestess. I love getting older so much. I turned 39 this year and felt one more layer of something shed. I am ready to own the crone. Our voices get clearer. Somehow it becomes easier to know the things you know, to apologize when you fucked up, to love and share the odd and godly thing that you are. Writing and making art and making up ritual and making gathering and making a life day to day with the kid, with a partner, transmutes me, ages me kindly. If you are in pain or feel far from your voice, this moment blesses you right now on your path to find your practice. Feel this surge come down the wire. Go forward electrified, fumbling joyfully to find the ways you are meant to transmute and express. Writing, cooking, drawing, dancing, sewing, metalwork, singing, video, resistance, education, healing, a new kind of praxis, all your own. Know that for Cameron, it was her through line. Nelson, for LA Review of Books, writes, what clearly was her saving grace through it all was her work. It is difficult in the context of today's art world, its climate of production and acquisition, and impenetrable levels of social status, to comprehend a practice as personal as Cameron's was. But just as the witch woman drawings were part of her mourning process, so was all her art a means of reckoning with reality. And heaven knows this reality can be hard to reckon with. But please know, your making, even on the smallest scale, spreads a dream of wings through the universe. Changes in culture happen like in the body, in the dark corners, the overlooked places, the microphagia and the gut. It happens in the unicorn cafes and out in the desert, in the tiny box of the voting booth, in the petri dish, in the soft click of the keyboard in the night. Cameron did not make art to appeal to buyers and sellers, to ease and appeal, but instead to disturb and combust, to reckon and to mourn and to heal. Wormwood Star ends with a refrain from Cameron's poem, Cinderella of the Wastelands, familiar to any heart-tired member of the faithful. How long, beloved God, how long? We sing this refrain still, waiting for things to make sense, for violence to end, for loved ones to come home safe, for wounds to heal, for a meaningful life of kindness and art to be possible without the grinding demands of late-stage capitalism. And so let's end with the whole poem. Let's call out alongside the Cinderella of the Wastelands, this loving, lonely call out to Babylon, to a female deity of darkness and light in balance at last. Lift our hearts to the sky, feel our roots reach down into the earth as we join with her in song, in reverence with the passion and bravery of a fire elemental and the gentle, steely backbone of a grandmother priestess. 7 times I rap upon the mighty door of the subterranean vault. Open. Open. I stand without in the drafty and bent corridor that approaches thy lair. 7 times resound my summons on the stony door, and the dead stern caves and cursed the midnight hour. Come thou forth. I bear a lamp for this terrible darkness. Thou shalt behold the face known in dreams. Mine eyes are terrible and strange, but thou knowest me. Behold, my garments are of a rich cloth, and I bear the air of a land of bounty beyond the sea. Come forth. Thou art in the shadow of the light I bear, and thy garments reek of the dead and the sun misplaced. We shall ascend the stair, which is fraught with unwholesome things. The stone rolls before me, and into the blazing vault of the night of nights we go forth as light. Dark star, I seek you in all the endless rooms of the universe. I have entered the maze of chaos and searched the promises. No end and no fulfillment, but I have seen your helmeted head flashing gold from all the bloody triumphs and sunsets of the world. I have heard your voice singing lonely songs of desire in the wild wind. I remember the artistry of fingers that held the rose in wonder. Your musical throat sounding the hymn of love, singing since the birth and the crashing star nebula. Kingdoms of muscle and star foam, pursued and pursuing. Radiant warrior, how long, my beloved God, how long, how long, how long?
You must be a witch.
Go to Foxglove Farm and use offer code Missing Witches.